Hi, and welcome to The Existential Coach. My name is Jordan O'Connor. This week I want to do a little bit of a different type of podcast, talking about something that's going on in Canada. It's been on the news around the world, and it's in some way an illustration of how things within our society, things within ourselves fragment. And when things fragment, when things come apart, it is natural that we look to a way to weave it together, whatever that way is. We have an idea, we have a belief, we have a conviction, and in whatever way that this certainty is informed, however it is operating in our lives, we decide that to follow that is to become free. That in having that conviction, following that conviction, and actualizing that conviction, we are free. And this raises questions about what is freedom. Now, we tend to think of freedom within a frame of some kind, which is in and of itself paradoxical. After all, if freedom is in a frame, how are we free? There is something framing us in, boxing us in, caging us in, locking us in. There is something to that experience that is decidedly unfree. So how can we be free when really we are talking about an experience of pushing against the state of unfree, yet that unstate or that unfree state is what defines our freedom. In effect, what happens is our freedom is contingent upon others. That is, we are actually in a relationship with one another, and we've defined ourselves in a way that is predicated upon the notion of freedom that is dependent. And this is the paradox of freedom. What I mean by the paradox is it is the contradiction, the central contradiction to freedom. That if everything is just free, then there is no, by definition, no freedom. Similarly, if everything is unfree, then there is, by definition, no freedom. Now, how does this work? Well, we are defining something. We are saying that there is this experience, and this is how this experience operates. And we, like I said before, we attach ourselves to an ideological frame, and that is the result of our need to create meaning. And we are driven to this meaning as a way to cope with, manage the fragmentation, the disconnection, the alienation. And so we see that there's two fundamental existential themes here, meaning and alienation, and the way in which that they intersect, the way in which these drives, if you will, these ideological drives affect us. And how if we are to have meaning, if we are to not feel alienated, not feel isolated, then we do this through some kind of narrative. This narrative is kind of a lifeline that lifts us from the void, lifts us from the nothingness. And this nothingness is something that raises the death anxiety. Again, another existential theme. And if life is meaningless, if there is really no purpose, then what are we doing here? What are we doing in a world that means nothing? So, the cries that I hear about what freedom is and the struggle for freedom that is currently going on can be understood as a need to bridge the fragmentation that a person is experiencing. And that need is profound. That need goes back to a fundamental driving force, and this is the fourth kind of theme of the existential kind of themes that I'm going to draw upon. That is, it's coming from this existential anxiety, the sense of energy. Anxiety here means this energy that is driving towards a created self, that is driving towards a realized self, that is driving towards life itself. Now, how that is manifest, that's infinite. And there is no singular way in which the creation of a person's being is going to be. Right? We can argue and debate notions of determinism or free will, and we can certainly argue, I think quite rightly, that there's an infinite number of influences upon those notions of free will. But fundamentally, what we're talking about is a drive, some force that is driving us towards life and away from death. And so, if we think about that drive, and we think about the freedom movement that is going on associated with the truckers currently in Ottawa and other places, but I'm going to focus mainly on Ottawa, then we begin to notice that, or we may begin to notice that the way in which freedom is understood is actually not clearly defined. So there's a couple of different ways in which we can look at what freedom is. So you can say, well, there's political freedom, for example. There's legal freedom, right? There's individual freedom of expression. And you can say that there's a kind of metaphysical or spiritual freedom. And each one has a different component to it. Yet, if we are not succinct in how we understand freedom, it is quite possible, and I would say quite often the case, that the want of a metaphysical or spiritual freedom is confounded with the political freedom or the physical freedom. So let me just back this up a bit. There is this idea that getting rid of these COVID mandates is a form of liberation. And this kind of notion of speaking truth to power has a really profound effect on us. We feel that we are being heard, or we are finally with a group of people that understand our experience. Yet, I find it increasingly incoherent. And here's just one example of what I think demonstrates the fundamental incoherence of this movement. And I think it's unfortunate because I think movements that genuinely deconstruct the way in which systems oppress us, I think movements that genuinely challenge the systematic way in which individuals are in fact inhibited, physically inhibited, politically inhibited, personally and spiritually inhibited. I think these are important and all the more invaluable to our experience as we move into a time of fragmentation. That we, in effect, elevate the degree of criticism that we can bring to structures that oppress us. So the wealth gap, right, for example, is a way to understand and something to critique that we can have a system that in some way or in all ways accepts that kind of division, that you can have individuals have a personal wealth that exceeds the GDP of some countries. And that is in some way normalized and exceptionalized, that we say, okay, that's fine. They're free to do that. So I think there's lots of ways in which we can critique freedom. But one of the things I think is unfortunate is within the trucker movement is the lost opportunity to genuinely critique the injustices that exist within our system, our society. So I'll give one example, and this was somebody had posted, and this is a connection on Facebook that I have personally. They had posted a photo of a Holocaust survivor's arm with the tattoo burned into their arm, a Jewish survivor of the Holocaust. And they then compared that with another photo of the code that's used to identify the vaccine passport. and they said, we do not learn from history. And their argument was, these are the same. Now, looking at this, I thought, the level of criticism, the level of understanding is so inconsequential that there isn't even the most, what I would think, mundane of distinctions made here, which is the Holocaust was the attempt to completely obliterate and eradicate the European Jew. It was a systematic destruction, a genocide that has had intergenerational effects and will continue to have intergenerational effects for hundreds of years. The vaccine passport, and more generally vaccines, are an initiative to keep people alive. That is, we can agree or disagree with whether or not we should have to get vaccinated. But to compare a gas chamber to a vaccine and to then indicate that because we can't see how this is the same thing, we have not learned from history, speaks to a form of fragmentation that fundamentally undermines the most general of our responsibilities. And this is a key thing here. We can get angry, we can get pissed off, we can get hurt, we can do all of these different things. But if we do not understand the way in which we impact others, the way in which our words are violences that can be used against people, not only have we not learned from history, not only are we repeating history, and not only have we condemned ourselves to this endless bardo of history, we have made ourselves completely unfree. We have removed ourselves from the criticism and critique necessary to free ourselves from tyranny. We have done nothing more than become the tyrant we feel we need to slay. We have, in effect, romanticized our lives and the heroics of our lives to such an extent that we have become entirely complicit in the rage, the hate, the contempt, and the loss of our own interconnectedness. And I started this podcast talking about identity, and I'm going to circle back to that with a story. And I hope it highlights the way in which our relationship to an identity imprisons us, makes us unfree. That by becoming trapped in this identity, our behaviors are operationalized by external forces. We are, by definition, unfree. So I want you to imagine, this is a story, it's kind of a conglomerate, but I want you to imagine there's a friend of yours. And they're artsy, left-leaning, and they've never been interested in vaccines. They feel that their body generates, and with the food that they eat, or the way that they live their lives, or their belief system, they feel that they can cure themselves. Their body is able to handle these things. So they say, I'm not going to get vaccinated. And this is something they've avoided even prior to COVID. Then various different mandates come out, mask things, the vaccines start to roll out, all this stuff happens. And they still don't want to get vaccinated. There's a vaccine passport that's limiting what they can do. Then a movement emerges about That's about removing all the mandates, removing the vaccine passport. And they started to become involved in that movement. Now, remember, this is a left-leaning person. Their identity was very much, quote unquote, on the socialist side of the aisle, if you want to think of it that way. Yet they start sharing with their friends right-wing propaganda, like the image I mentioned earlier. And when anything appears in that in these protests, that is, like Confederate flags or Nazi symbolism, they say, well, that's the exception. That's really not what's going on here. That has nothing to do with the movement. But what I'm struck by is their identity was, prior to this, as a left-leaning artsy person, and now they're a right-wing, or they are involved with the right-wing propagation of propaganda. And they say, well, it's not propaganda. I mean, I saw it. It's truth. It's speaking truth to power. Well, is propaganda speaking truth to power? Well, what's the criteria for speaking truth to power? What's the criteria for freedom? And this is really the central point here. What is the criteria for freedom? Is freedom about you feeling you're free? Is freedom about you doing what you want? You don't want to get vaccinated, so if you have to or you're forced to, then you are unfree? Okay, so it's about individual freedom, I guess, or it's about your political right to choose. What is that freedom actually about? And I don't know. I talked to an anti-vaxxer who said, I would sign a document that said, if I get sick, you don't need to put me in a hospital. His answer to not wanting to be vaccinated was to have us create a passport for anti-vaxxers that would forbid them from being medically treated for COVID-related illnesses. And that to him was quite reasonable. The vaccine passport was unreasonable, but an anti-vax passport was reasonable. Again, I ask, what is freedom? In thinking about these situations, and there's many, I don't know what freedom is. I don't understand what freedom is. And I find myself coming back to this question, because none of it seems very free to me. It seems like if a person is against a vaccine passport but for an anti-vax passport, if a person doesn't want to be vaccinated and is willing to die because I don't understand where the freedom is. I'm really kind of at a loss. What is the freedom? Is it the freedom to choose? If so, who shaped what that choice was about? And this is the critical question. Who framed that notion of freedom that we have fallen for, that we are following, that we see as being the foundational way to understand our expression, our identity? And whatever that image is, can we ask, when did that become what freedom is? Is that what freedom is? The freedom to choose, regardless of the quality of that choice, the reasonableness of the choice, the merits of that choice, even the truth of that choice, right? If we're adopting propaganda as truth, if we are using volume as the mitigator and the indicator of how true something is, then what is truth? Is there anything we can actually reasonably say is true? And I think this in a way reflects something that goes far beyond the anti-vaxxer movement. I think that's actually a very kind of small part of this equation. I think the big question is that is important to ask is, to what extent are we influenced by the fragmentation of our society, the disconnection of our society? How is alienation operating within our thinking? How is our need for meaning compromising the quality of the meaning that we are attuning ourselves to and then creating our identity from? How is our fear of death driving us straight towards death? And I think as we look at these questions, as I look at these questions, I'm constantly coming up against this wall of I don't understand how any of this is about freedom. So people say, no, it's very much about freedom. I watched truckers say very candidly and very openly, we are standing up for the freedom of Canadians. What we are doing here is we're doing the hard work of any freedom movement, in effect, that we are standing up for Canadians who have had enough with these mandates. We're standing up for Canadians who need to be freed from the controls of the government. We are freedom fighters. What's a freedom fighter? What's the issue? What is the thing they're fighting for? Well, the thing we're fighting for here is control in the midst of uncertainty. The thing we're fighting for is its last call on planet Earth, and we don't know what's going on. It's panic. There is no symbolic unity here. I think one of the things that struck me about the left-leaning friend who became the friend of the right wing is it pointed something out that I don't think we understand in our society. And I don't think because I don't think we have a way to understand it. This idea of left and right is absurd. This idea of constructing identity in that way, in that political way, is absurd. And it's absurd because the crisis that people are experiencing goes beyond there being a political crisis of right and left. This is about a real spiritual crisis, a metaphysical crisis for who we are and how we are in this world. And we have no answer. The gates are open. There is no sense of certainty to this. There is no real sense of direction even to this. We are, in effect, lost and scrambling to be found, which is precisely why we don't have any truth. We don't have truth in an environment where we can't explore and understand things. We don't have truth in an environment where we are just exponentially dumping rhetoric onto people before we've even thought about it or we've even looked at it. Like I pointed out with that meme, there is such a lack of reflection that we are living as if we are its last call on planet Earth, that we can't really see what's going on. There is no tomorrow. It's just get a bunch of drinks and just drive into the brick wall. And there is this sense that we're not really constructing so much as, and it's not that we're deconstructing, it's that we just don't believe. So I wonder, as I listen to people talk about being freedom fighters and thinking in those terms, I wonder, is this really the meaning that we all long for? In this way, is this movement reflecting something we all in various different ways desire? Is this entirely misguided? It's not truly taking down it's not dealing, for example, with the vast and increasingly vast wage inequities. It's not dealing with, and certainly in the United States, it's not dealing with voter rights suppression. It's not dealing with, internationally, for example, lots of countries would like the vaccine, but do not have access to the vaccine. It's not actually dealing with the fundamental structural things that are going on that are actually oppressing us. It's not actually dealing with the true question of freedom, which is, what choice does a person have who is unfree? In a sense, the trucker movement is the thing you do when you are unfree. I don't know what we're doing. So we get rid of masks, We say you don't have to be vaccinated. We say if people die, people die. That seems to be what it is. The freedom to just let things happen. The freedom to let the cards fall as they may. If people get sick, they get sick. If people die, they die. That's freedom. So that doesn't seem like choice. That seems like the opposite of choice. That seems like this very idea of freedom is about abandoning our responsibility, about abandoning the tough questions, about abandoning the challenges that we face. It seems like this form of freedom is giving up. After all, if the plan is to just let whatever happen, happen, if the act of being free is to just let whatever happen, happen, who benefits? Who benefits when people are dying? Who benefits from the division? Who benefits from the state of panic that arises when people can't get into a healthcare system? Who benefits from that? Who benefits? The question to ask is who benefits if we do nothing or we stop doing what we've been doing about a health issue? Who benefits? Now, on this podcast, my point is not to speculate about who benefits, but it is to raise this fundamental existential question, which is, we need meaning, we need connection. We experience anxiety, and we have an awareness on some level that we will die. And all of these fundamental questions, in effect, up the ante on our experience, challenging us as we face things like a global pandemic, challenging us as we face things like in the United States in particular, voter suppression, challenging us in things like internationally, the inaccess to vaccines. Remember, some countries, some continents have nowhere near the option to not have it. Right? They want it. They are clamoring at the World Health Organization, clamoring at the companies that have the vaccine for making billions of dollars in profit and not making sure that everybody is getting access, that everybody has the choice. So when we talk about the truckers' freedom movement and we think about those who do not have access to the vaccine, when we talk about the truckers' freedom movement and we think about individuals who were, when we think about the European Jewry and others who were killed during the Holocaust and World War II, when we think about all of these different things, and then we look at blocking roads to not wear masks and to not have vaccine passports, and that's freedom? Who benefits? Who is behind the trucker movement? As I said, the trucker movement is incidental here. The bigger question is, who is behind? What is behind? That's the thing to look at. So, I'm not even sure how to end this podcast other than to say, I hope this invites you to think more about this in a non-political way, in a kind of turn off Facebook, turn off Instagram, turn off all of the different social media things, and just think about what it means to be free, what it means to have choice, what it means to be safe, what it means to exist, what it means to live your life. And then ask yourself, what are the obstacles to that? What are the obstacles to my freedom? And perhaps above all, what is the quality of my freedom? What is the quality of my choice? So, as always, I'm interested in hearing what you think. You can reach out and find me at jordano'connor.com. Until next time, bye for now.